Chicago does not apologize for its cold. The wind off Lake Michigan hits the glass towers of the financial district like a verdict, not a weather event, and the key, Caldwell building, takes it the way it takes everything, without moving, without yielding. 32 floors of gray stone and tinted glass that has been in the business of deciding who matters for long enough that the decision feels like architecture. Pull back far enough, and the building looks like every other tower on this block. Move closer, and you start to see the lobby, the marble floor, the fountain nobody watches, the security desk with the leather visitor book squared precisely at the corner, and a man, sitting in a chair on the 14th floor, both hands flat on a leather case, back straight, eyes forward. He has been there since 8:41 in the morning. Nobody has asked his name. 2 floors below him, a woman is holding a file that 2,300 families are depending on. The clock says 5:11. The bank closes at 6. The man does not move.
There is a specific kind of cold that only expensive lobbies know how to make. Not the cold of weather. Not the cold of neglect. The cold of intention. Marble that was chosen for its indifference. Air conditioning calibrated to remind you, without saying a word, that comfort here is conditional. That warmth is something you earn by belonging. The Caldwell building had mastered this particular temperature. 32 floors of glass and gray stone rising out of the west side of Chicago's financial district. The kind of structure that looks in photographs like it was designed to make people feel small on purpose, which it was. Everything about it was. Darnell Cooper knew this before he walked through the door. He had parked at 836 in a visitor space on the north side of the lot because the reserved spaces along the east wall had names painted in white on the asphalt, and none of those names were his. He sat in the truck for 4 minutes, not from nerves, from habit. The habit of a man who has learned to read a room before he enters it, to take inventory of the exits and the power lines and the small signals that tell you who owns the air in a given space. The lot told him things. The names on the asphalt told him more. He noted which names had multiple spaces. He noted the single space near the elevator bay with no name on it at all. Just a yellow painted curb and a reserved sign that had been there long enough for the paint to peel at the corners. He filed that away. He got out of the truck slowly, not because his body required it, though he had turned 53 the previous November, and his left knee registered changes in weather before any meteorologist in the city did. He got out slowly because he was already in the experiment, already watching, already counting. The blazer was charcoal, almost black. He had pressed it himself that morning on the kitchen table at Renner Yard before the sun came up, standing in the half-dark in his undershirt, with the iron making that particular hiss. That means the fabric is accepting what you're asking of it. He folded it across his left forearm now, carrying it rather than wearing it, because Chicago in late April can turn on you between the parking lot and the front door, and he wanted to be comfortable for what was going to be a long day. The leather case was thin. It held 3 letters and 1 blank authorization sheet and nothing else. He had owned it for 11 years, bought it the week he closed his first brokerage deal in a spare bedroom with a laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks because the desk he'd ordered hadn't arrived yet. The leather had darkened at the corners where his hand gripped it. He carried it by the handle now, and he carried it the way a man carries something he has thought about for a long time. The boots were the only thing that gave him away, if you knew what you were looking at. Dark leather, polished at the kitchen table the same morning as the blazer. The same methodical circles with the same cloth his father had used and passed down without ceremony, the way Harold Reed passed down everything that mattered. But the heels carried a thin line of gray along the welt where Renner Yard lived. Concrete dust from the bays. The particular pale gray of a freight terminal floor, different from sidewalk gray, different from parking lot gray, specific to the compounds they used to seal those floors so the forklifts didn't tear them up. That dust does not come out. After a while you stop trying. After a while you understand that it is not a flaw but a record. And records are the only honest thing a man leaves behind. On his left wrist, his father's watch. Steel case. Scratched crystal. The face was simple. No date window, no second hand that worked. Just hours and minutes in a font so plain it looked more like a statement than a design. Harold Reed had worn that watch for 19 years on the dock at Bridgepoint Freight before his hands got bad. Enough that he couldn't work the clasp anymore. He'd handed it to Darnell at a kitchen table in January, midwinter, sliding it across the formica without looking up from his coffee, the way Harold Reed handed over anything that cost him something, sideways, without ceremony. Once, the lobby doors were heavy and automated, and they opened with a sound like an intake of breath. Raymond Harris had been at that desk for 11 years. He was 63 years old, white, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested Unger life, spent doing physical work, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead where they lived most of the day, descending to his nose only when something required actual focus. His uniform was pressed with the precision of a man who understood that the details of his presentation were the only thing standing between him and invisibility. He had a quality that front desk workers either arrive with or never develop, the quality of occupying his space, as though he had been placed there deliberately by someone who understood exactly what that space required. He did not perform alertness. He simply was alert, at all times, without effort, the way some people are simply tall. The visitor book was a standard leather-bound log, brown cover, gold-embossed lines on the spine. Raymond slid it across the desk before Darnell reached the counter, a reflex worn smooth by 11 years of repetition. "Morning, sir. Who are you here to see?" "Robert Williams." 9 o'clock. Darnell took the pen without being offered one, found the first clean line on the page, and wrote in his own hand. D. Cooper, 9-0 R. Williams. Arrived 8:41. The handwriting was small and controlled, letters that sat close together without touching. The handwriting of a man who learned early that precision costs nothing and sloppiness costs more than you can predict. Raymond looked at the name, looked up once, wrote guest 23 on a clip badge in blue ballpoint, the same ballpoint he kept clipped to his shirt pocket. He slid the badge across and wrote the same number in the column beside the entry, a motion so practiced it didn't require him to look at his own hand. 14th floor, sir. Elevators on your left. Bring that badge back down when you're finished. I keep count. I will. He didn't. And that badge, that small plastic clip with the number 23 on it, not returned to a desk that had been waiting for it, is the only reason this story exists. The elevator was empty. Darnell wrote it alone, and he did not look at himself in the mirrored panels the way most people look at themselves in elevator mirrors. The quick self-inventory, the hair check, the tie adjustment, the rehearsal of expression. He looked straight ahead. He had nothing to rehearse. He had done his preparation in the dark at a kitchen table in a converted dispatch office 2 miles from this building. And whatever was going to happen today was going to happen because he allowed it to, not because he managed it. The doors opened on 14. New carpet, the specific smell of buildings that have recently renovated, synthetic fibers, and the ghost of adhesive, and something citrusy that gets piped in through the HVAC to make you feel like cleanliness, is native to the place rather than manufactured. A reception desk in front of a glass wall. Behind the glass wall, a boardroom with frosted doors and a long table whose shape you could make out, but whose occupants, when they arrived, would be reduced to silhouettes. Ashley Thomas was behind the desk, 26, 27. Dark blonde hair pulled back with the kind of effortlessness that takes 20 minutes to achieve. She had the practiced brightness of someone who answered phones for a living and had learned to calibrate her energy to whoever came off the elevator, warm enough to be welcoming, professional enough to maintain distance. She was good at her job. The problem, the specific problem, that would matter 12 days later when an outside firm was reviewing every timestamp on her system, was that she was good at the version of her job that the building had taught her to do. And the building had taught her certain things about who came off that elevator, wearing a blazer and carrying a leather case, and what that usually meant, and what it almost never meant. She looked up. The brightness engaged automatically. "Hi there. Are you here for the doctor?" Because the doctor's office is actually around on Kessler, the freight side of the building. A quick, genuine-seeming smile. I only mention it because people come in here all the time. The signage really isn't great. Darnell set the leather case on the counter. He didn't push it toward her. He placed it flat and left his hand on it. And when he spoke, his voice carried the specific texture of a man who has been underestimated so many times that the experience has become data rather than injury. I have a 9 o'clock with Robert Williams. Cooper. C-R-O-S-S. Cooper, she said, and typed it, and her eyes moved across the screen with the micro-expressions of someone who has found something unexpected and is deciding in real time how to frame it. She typed it again. Scrolled. The small furrow between her eyebrows appeared and deepened. I'm not seeing anything. Which doesn't necessarily mean. She paused. Sometimes things don't sync right. It happens. Are you sure it was confirmed? 11 days ago. Right. Okay. Her eyes went briefly to the frosted doors of the boardroom, then back to her monitor. She believed the monitor. That was the decision, made in under a second, that she would have to account for later. Do you want to maybe take a seat and I'll check with someone? She didn't check with anyone. Darnell chose the third chair from the boardroom door, not the closest, not the farthest. The third one, because from that position, he had an unobstructed line to the elevator bank and could see every arrival without appearing to watch for them. He laid the folded blazer across his knees, set the case on top of the blazer, placed both hands flat on the case, back straight, feet planted, chin level. He would not substantially alter that position for the next 8.5 hours. Now, before that day becomes the story, before the photographs and the depositions and the boardroom reading and the chat logs and the 2 years of forensic work that followed, before the thing became what it became, you need to understand what Harold Reed knew, and what Harold Reed never had to explain twice because he only said it once, and what Darnell Cooper was still at 53 years old in the process of finishing. Harold Reed loaded trailers for Bridgepoint Freight for 31 years. This was back when Bridgepoint was 6 trucks and a gravel lot and a phone number written in paint on the side of a corrugated metal shed outside of Cicero, before the acquisitions, before the tower, before the name meant anything to anyone who didn't work the docks. He came home in January with his forearms scraped raw, the particular damage of cold metal and rough wood, and the kind of work that doesn't make allowances for the temperature of a human body. He never complained where Darnell could hear it. Not once in 31 years. Not a word. The complaints went somewhere else, somewhere Darnell has never located and his father never showed him, and the silence that came home instead was its own kind of instruction. This is the cost. This is what it costs. You pay it. Harold Reed gave his son exactly one rule. He gave it in a parking lot in January, leaning against the hood of a car with his hands in the pockets of a work coat that had been washed too many times and had gone the particular pale color of things that were once darker. He was looking at something in the middle distance, the way men of that generation looked when they were about to hand over something that mattered, sideways, once, without preamble and without follow-up. The rule arrived and then the conversation was over, as though the rule was all there was to say and everything else would be improvised. Son, if a man has to say his name to get treated right, then whatever he built isn't worth what he thinks it is. Darnell was 16. He stood in that parking lot and nodded, the way 16-year-olds nod at things that are too large for them to hold yet. Storing them in some place the body keeps better than the mind does, where they sit for years until the right moment calls them up intact and fully formed. He didn't understand the rule completely until he was 26, sitting across from a man in a nice shirt in a small conference room at Bridgepoint Freight's original building on Pulaski, the one that smelled like diesel and floor wax, the man explaining in the voice people use when they think they're doing you a favor that clients on the telephone tended to prefer a certain kind of voice. Nothing was stated that anyone could have written on paper. Nothing ever is. But the room understood itself very clearly, and Darnell understood the room, and he thanked the man politely and went back to his desk and finished his shift and handed in his badge at the end of it. He had started at Bridgepoint at 22. Night dispatch. Radio in one hand, clipboard in the other, working out of a portable building at Renner Yard, the original operations hub 2 miles from the tower that would eventually get built. A building the size of a double-wide trailer with a space heater that tripped the breaker every single time someone in the break room ran the microwave. He learned the freight business in that building. He learned the rhythm of the docks and the language of the drivers and the specific arithmetic of moving physical things across physical distances on a schedule that paper could not contain, but that a man with the right kind of attention could hold in his head like a map. He was good at it. He was very good at it. The kind of good that makes other people in a room turn their heads slightly when you speak. Not because your voice is loud, but because it carries the weight of someone who has already accounted for what they're about to say. He left at 26. He left because of the man in the nice shirt. And he built his own brokerage in a spare bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, with a laptop and a landline and a wall calendar, because the project management software he'd looked at cost more per month than his rent. It took him 11 years, not 11 years of slow, grinding failure. 11 years of the kind of work that doesn't make it into the stories people tell about success, because it lacks the drama of collapse and recovery. Just work. Consistent, early, methodical work. The same quality his father had brought to the dock for 31 years, redirected into something that did not require a man to come home in January with his forearms raw. 3 years ago, his holding company acquired Bridgepoint Freight Systems in a private transaction structured through 3 intermediate entities and a trust that had no name anyone would recognize. The deal never appeared in the local business press. Darnell did not issue a statement. He did not put his name on the building. He did not hang a portrait in the lobby, or send a company-wide email, or attend the quarterly managers' meeting to introduce himself. He told the board, in a brief meeting in a conference room, he had asked them to rent at a neutral location rather than in the tower, that he was not interested in becoming a story. He was interested in whether the trucks ran on time. They did. Under his ownership, they ran on time at a rate that had improved 6 percentage points over the previous administration's best year. He knew this because he checked the terminal reports himself, twice a week, from his desk at Renner Yard, the converted dispatch office that still smelled like diesel and burnt coffee, and had one window that looked directly onto the loading dock. He had asked them not to renovate it. The new carpet smell of the 14th floor was, in its own way, a kind of rebuke. He preferred the smell of the dock. It reminded him where the money came from. It reminded him what the money was for. There were 2,300 people on Bridgepoint's payroll across 14 terminals in 4 states. Most of them believed the company was owned by an investment group in another state. There was no welcome video with his face in it. There was no company portrait in a lobby. There was a signature at the bottom of every paycheck that printed out of this building, twice a month, on schedule. Small letters, tight, blue ink, D. Cooper. And in 3 years, not one person on the 14th floor had ever thought to wonder whose hand had put them there. This mattered more than it sounds like it should, because the payroll system at Bridgepoint ran on a process so old that every consultant who had ever billed the company for an assessment had put it on the first slide of their presentation with a red X through it. Dual control authorization. The controller built the file. The payroll director verified it line by line against the terminal reports, every entry, every dollar. And then the sole signatory of record had to appear in the building, in person, and countersign a paper authorization sheet by hand before the bank processed the release at 6 o'clock in the evening. An antique, a relic, a procedural vestige of an era when the alternative to this kind of manual check was that someone walked out the door with the company's money and you didn't find out for 6 weeks. Every consultant said to replace it with a digital authorization process and a tiered approval structure. Darnell said no. He said no because twice a month, this process required him to look at the total number of human beings, depending on this company, printed on a single sheet in a font small enough to require actual attention. It was not a number he wanted to encounter on a dashboard with a colored status indicator. He wanted to see it on paper. He wanted to feel the weight of it as a thing that required his physical presence and his handwritten signature and his deliberate act of showing up. There was another clause in the same bylaw. 4 sentences that no one had thought about in years because there had never been a reason to think about them. The verifying officer does not leave the room containing the payroll file on a release day. Not for lunch, not for a phone call, not for anything, until the signed authorization is in hand or the bank's cutoff time has passed. The verifying officer stays. Kathleen Robinson had run payroll at Bridgepoint Freight for 22 years. She was 58 years old and 4 feet 11 in work shoes, and she kept the key to the gray steel cabinet in the basement, the cabinet that held the signature plate used to stamp Darnell Cooper's name onto every physical check the company printed, on a chain around her neck under her cardigan, where she could feel it with her fingertips when she needed to remind herself of her own authority. She was, in the specific and load-bearing sense of the word, the person who understood what this company owed its people and what happened if that understanding failed. She also knew Darnell Cooper's face. She had processed his time cards when he was 22 years old and working night dispatch out of the portable building at Renner Yard. She had seen him in the break room of that portable building once at 2 in the morning, eating a sandwich out of a paper bag and reading a freight manifesto he had printed out and annotated in the margins in pencil because the screen bothered his eyes late at night. She had thought, at the time, that this was an unusual thing for a 22-year-old dispatcher to be doing at 2 in the morning. She had filed it away, and when the private acquisition closed 3 years ago, and the new signatory's name appeared on the authorization documents, and she had looked at those tight, small letters and understood whose hand they came from, she had gone very still at her desk for approximately 45 seconds, and then returned to the payroll file she had been verifying. She would have recognized the back of his head in a crowded room. On this particular Thursday, Kathleen Robinson was in a room with no windows on the 12th floor, the file verified and complete, and sitting in front of her, and she could not leave to go get the signature she needed because the bylaw that the man whose signature she needed had personally refused to eliminate for 3 consecutive years was holding her in place. She did not know yet that he was 2 floors above her. She would not know this for another 6 hours and 51 minutes. And this is where the letters matter, because the letters are the reason he was in this building. And the letters are the reason he was sitting in that chair with his hands on a leather case and his mouth closed. And the letters are the reason that when he could have ended the entire situation with a single phone call, he chose not to. They had come to Renner Yard over 5 months, 3 of them. 3 different handwritings, 3 different materials, 3 different approaches to the problems of saying something to someone you have no formal channel to reach. The first was written in ballpoint pen on lined paper, the kind that comes in a yellow legal pad, and the handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who had thought about every word before committing to it. The second was typed on a terminal computer, by someone who had taken the additional precaution of using a typeface that could not be traced to a specific machine. The third was written in pencil on the back of a dispatch sheet from a terminal Darnell had spent 3 days trying to identify and ultimately could not. None of them were signed. All 3 said the same thing in different words. If you are not somebody, you do not get past 14. He had read them enough times to know them without looking. He had done what you do when you receive a complaint you cannot verify from a source you cannot identify. He had sat with it. He had turned it in every direction. He had asked himself the honest question, which was whether he was being told something about a building or something about a series of bad days. And he had sat with the honest question long enough that he had earned the right to an honest answer. The honest answer was that he didn't know, and not knowing was its own kind of information. So he had called Bridgepoint's corporate scheduling line 11 days before this Thursday and booked a 9 o'clock with Robert Williams, the division president for the corporate group, under his own name with no title attached, the way he always booked things, because he had never in his life used a title as a leading credential, and he wasn't going to start. The person who took the booking confirmed it. He received a confirmation email from the scheduling system at 9:47 that evening. He printed it. He did not bring the printout with him because the point was not to have documentation of the confirmation. The point was to see what happened when a man with a name and a confirmed appointment arrived at a building where no one knew his face. He knew what the signature was for. The signature was the legitimate reason to be in the building, the thread of actual business that kept this from being theater. He was not here to perform. He was here to find out something true. And the only way to find out something true about how a building treats people it doesn't recognize was to be a person that building didn't recognize. The phone in his blazer pocket had been on silent since 8:30. It would stay there, under both his hands and the leather case, for the next 9 hours. At 9:04 in the morning, Sandra Anderson came through the glass door. She came through with a phone in her right hand and a coffee cup in her left, and the forward momentum of someone whose morning was already behind schedule, and who was allocating exactly no attention to the perimeter of the space she was moving through. She was beautiful in the specific way of women who have learned to make their beauty functional, to use it as a form of authority rather than invitation. And she moved with the assurance of someone whose authority had rarely been questioned in this building. She wore heels that added 3 inches she didn't need. Her hair was the dark gold of someone who had been spending money on it for long enough that the money was invisible in the result. Her eyes swept the room the way eyes sweep rooms they own, and when they found the man in the third chair, they performed an assessment so rapid and so complete that it was finished before she had taken 2 steps past him. Down first, the boots, the gray line of concrete dust on the heels. Up, the case, the position of the hands, the absence of a phone or a bag or any of the accessories that signaled the specific kind of business her floor conducted. Up to the face, under 2 seconds. Filed and closed. Deliveries go around the back. I'm not delivering anything. I have a 9 her head. Exactly once. The way a sound turns your head when it doesn't match the environment it's coming from. She was already past him, and she turned back, and she said, "There's no 9 o'clock. Today is review day. Leave a card with Ashley." I don't carry cards. And that, the absence of a business card in a building where every transaction is preceded by the exchange of business cards, was the second thing that turned her head. The first had been his voice, not its tone, which was flat and unhurried, and entirely without the notes of apology or explanation that she had learned to expect from people who were told they were in the wrong place. It was the fact that the voice did not move at all, did not go up, did not go down, did not offer anything that could be used as either concession or leverage. It just said what it said. She looked at him for 1 additional second. Then you can wait. It was the only time Sandra Anderson looked directly at him all day. At 9:11, Robert Williams came out of the elevator. He was talking to 2 men in half-zip pullovers about a boat that someone's brother-in-law had recently purchased in Florida. He was doing most of the talking, and most of the talking was not going anywhere in particular, which was broadly characteristic of how Robert Williams operated in spaces he controlled. He had the easy locomotion of a man whose comfort in a room had never been questioned by the room. He passed within 4 feet of the third chair. There were 3 people in the hallway who saw what happened next, and none of those 3 people thought about it again until they were asked about it under oath. Robert Williams glanced down. His mouth opened perhaps half an inch. For approximately a second and a half, he was on the verge of saying something to the effect of, "Hey, has someone grabbed this gentleman?" in the casual, dispersed way of a person tossing a responsibility toward whoever was closest enough to catch it. His phone vibrated against his hip. He kept walking. The 2 men in the half-zip pullovers kept walking. The conversation about the boat continued. That was the closest the 14th floor came to ordinary decency in 9 hours. At 9:15, the boardroom filled. 14 people. The frosted doors swung shut with the soft authority of expensive hardware and settled. Through the glass wall, Darnell could see the shapes of people and the blue glow of a projector coming alive. He could hear the outline of laughter without any of the words in it. The particular shape that sound makes when it is warm and insider and belongs to people who know each other in the specific way of people who spend 40 hours a week in the same building. He did not move. He had spent the previous morning at Renner Yard, sitting in the dispatch office with the window that looked out at the loading dock, watching a crew work through the final check on a trailer headed for the Nashville terminal. There was a ritual to it. The way the dock crew moved around a loaded trailer, the walk-around, the tap of the doors, the check of the seals, the particular knock on the floor of the trailer bed that tells you something about the load's distribution without the need for instruments. He had watched that walk-around, and he had thought about the 3 letters in the leather case, and he had thought about his father's hands. In the last winter, he worked the dock, January raw at the forearms from the cold and the material, and he had made a decision that was actually a non-decision, which is the purest kind. He was going to sit in whatever chair they gave him, and he was going to watch what happened when a man with a name and a confirmed appointment and a legitimate reason to be there was assigned the category of nobody by people who had made up their minds about categories before they had any information. Because the second he said his name out loud, with its full meaning, the experiment was over. And the second the experiment was over, he would never know what those 3 unsigned letters were trying to tell him. Not really. Not in the way you know something you have witnessed, rather than something you have been told. He had thought about his father leaning on the hood of that car in the parking lot, and he had understood, maybe for the first time completely, that the rule had 2 parts, and he had only ever been living the first one. If a man has to say his name to get treated right, that was the part he'd always understood. The part he was still learning was what happened when the man didn't say his name. What you found out when you removed the name from the equation and let the room show you what the room actually was. The 3rd chair from the boardroom door, blazer folded on his knees, case on the blazer, both hands flat, back straight, feet on the floor. The building moved around him. Phones rang behind the glass. Footsteps crossed the reception area in patterns that told you things about urgency and rank and the particular choreography of a corporate floor at 9:15 in the morning. Ashley Thomas typed at her 3 screens with the focused efficiency of someone who had found a groove in the work and was staying in it. The elevator opened 3 times in the first 20 minutes, and each time it was someone who got off and was absorbed immediately into the building's movement, greeted or waved through, or collected by someone who had been waiting for them. 6 minutes. That was the average. He would learn this number later, much later, from a report compiled by people who had spent 2 years going through records he had never thought to ask for. 6 minutes was the average time between arrival and collection for visitors to the 14th floor. He would sit for 9 hours. He would become, in the language of that report, one of 19. But he did not know that yet. He only knew what he knew at 9:18 on a Thursday morning in April, which was that his name was on the first line of a leather-bound book 2 floors below him, and nobody in the building had read it. He had eaten a banana in the truck at 6 in the morning. He had not brought anything else. Not from oversight. He had understood, before he came, that comfort is leverage in situations like this, that hunger and thirst and the need to move create pressure, and pressure creates decisions, and decisions create noise, and noise ends the experiment. So he had eaten the banana at 6, and he had made his peace with the rest of the day, and he had come to the building the way his father went to the dock in January, with the understanding that the cost was the cost, and the cost was already paid, and now you just did the work. The boardroom filled with 14 people. The frosted doors settled into their frame. Outside those doors, in the 3rd chair from the door, a man placed both hands flat on a leather case that held 3 unsigned letters from people who worked for him and 1 blank page waiting for his signature. He did not open his mouth. He waited, and the building, the cold and expensive and self-certain building, went about its morning completely unaware that it was already on trial. The thing about waiting, real waiting, the kind that is a choice rather than a circumstance, is that it requires you to make a decision every minute about whether to keep choosing it. Most people think of patience as a state, as something you enter and then inhabit. It is not. It is a series of decisions made at the rate of one per moment, each one requiring you to look at the cost and agree again to pay it. Darnell Cooper had learned this at 22, in the portable building at Renner Yard, on the shifts that ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, the shifts when the dispatch radio went quiet around 2, and there was nothing to do but be present and alert for the calls that came in and the ones that didn't. He had learned to make time into something other than a container of boredom. He had learned to make it into a landscape you walk through with attention. He walked through the first hour of this particular Thursday with attention. He noted that Ashley Thomas answered her phone at 9:22 with the slightly different cadence she used for internal calls versus external ones. He noted that the boardroom received a catering delivery at 9:45. A cart with a coffee set up and a tray of pastries, wheeled in by a man who had not signed the visitor book downstairs and had not been asked to. He noted the specific quality of silence in the hallway between the elevator bank and the boardroom, the way it was not actually silent but was instead filled with the layered noise of ventilation and distant keyboards, and the occasional voice that carried from behind a door without resolving into words. He noted the quality of the light, which came through a window at the end of the hallway and moved across the floor as the morning turned. He noted his own body's relationship to the chair, the way the good posture he had maintained since sitting down was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but simply correct, the way his father's posture on the dock had been neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but simply what the job required. He thought about Harold Reed. He did not do this for comfort. He did it because Harold Reed was the reason he understood that the thing happening in this building today was not personal. It was structural. It was the product of a building that had organized itself around a set of invisible assumptions about who counted as a person worth attention, and those assumptions had become so ingrained in the movement and the habit and the reflex of the people who worked there that they did not experience them as assumptions at all. They experienced them as common sense, as obvious, as the way things naturally sorted themselves out when you let them. His father had known this. Harold Reed had known this in the particular way you know things you cannot say at a meeting, cannot document in a report, cannot raise through any formal channel, because the formal channel is itself built from the same assumptions you would need to challenge in order to use it. Harold Reed had known it, and had handed his son a single sentence in a parking lot, and then never mentioned it again, because there was nothing else to say. The sentence was complete. The rest was for Darnell to learn on his own, which was the only way anyone learns anything that actually takes root. At 9:58 in the morning, a woman came off the elevator with a laptop bag and a travel mug and walked straight to the glass door without making eye contact with anything in the waiting area. She badged through, disappeared into the floor behind the glass wall. She did not appear to see the man in the third chair, or she appeared to choose not to. The distinction Darnell understood was not always knowable from the outside. Sometimes not seeing is a decision. Sometimes it is simply what the eye does when it has been trained long enough in the geometry of who occupies which spaces. He thought about the 3 letters. He thought about the specific effort involved in writing to someone you have never met about something you cannot prove, using words that could cost you if they were ever traced back. He thought about the person who had used a typewriter or a terminal set to a generic typeface to say what needed to be said in a way that could not be attributed. He thought about the person who had found a dispatch sheet and flipped it over and picked up a pencil. The dispatch sheet was the one that bothered him most, because whoever wrote that letter had access to a terminal dispatch sheet, which meant they worked in operations, which meant they were doing the same job his father had done, moving physical things across physical distances for this company, and they had taken a piece of the paper that documented that work and turned it over and used the blank side to say something to the person who owned the company they worked for, something that the company's official channels had given them no way to say. "We are not asking for anything. We just want to know if the people at the top know we are down here." He was down here now, 2 floors below the people at the top, in a chair in a hallway, and the experiment was going exactly the way the 3 letters had suggested it would go. At 10:04, Ashley Thomas's phone rang and she answered it with a smile you could hear in her voice, the particular warmth of a call from someone she liked, and she said, "Oh, hey, let me check." And she looked at her computer and typed something and said, "Yeah, go ahead, he's expecting you." And 30 seconds later, the elevator opened and a man came off it, who had not signed the book downstairs, and who went directly to the glass door and pressed a badge against the reader and walked through without stopping at the desk. The elevator to the boardroom had taken him 1 minute and 15 seconds. Darnell did not write that down yet. He was still only watching. The writing would begin later, when he had something to compare. He looked at his father's watch, 10:07. He adjusted his weight slightly in the chair, the first physical adjustment he had made since sitting down, and he felt the leather case shift under his hands, and he pressed both palms flat again, back straight, chin level. He had decided, in the truck that morning, that his physical posture in this chair would be the same at 5 in the afternoon as it was at 9 in the morning. Because posture is information. Posture is what the body broadcasts to the room about what it believes about itself. And the room, this floor, this building, was going to receive a consistent broadcast from the man in the 3rd chair, regardless of what it decided to send back. The morning turned at the pace that mornings turn when you have made the decision to let them go at their own speed rather than fighting them. The ventilation ran its cycle. The light moved across the floor at the pace of a clock's minute hand, visible only if you didn't look directly at it. The boardroom behind the frosted doors produced its muffled sound, the shape of a presentation, the rhythm of a question and an answer and a longer answer, the particular kind of laughter that happens when a joke lands in a room where everyone wants to be seen appreciating the joke. At 10:20, the reception phone rang with the double pulse of an internal call. Ashley answered it with the professional brightness she kept calibrated for the desk. And then, as she listened to whatever was being said on the other end, her voice shifted a register. Not lower, higher. The half-step rise that comes with the need to manage someone's expectation gently and without creating conflict. 14th floor, this is Ashley. A pause. No, ma'am, I can promise you. I've been here since 8 o'clock. There's nobody here by that name. Another pause, slightly longer. I understand. I'll keep an eye out. She set the receiver down. She did not look at the man in the 3rd chair. The man in the 3rd chair had heard both sides of the call with clarity that surprised neither of them, because the hallway was quiet and quiet rooms carry. 2 floors below, Kathleen Robinson set down her phone. She had her payroll file open in front of her. Every line had been verified. The number at the bottom of the sheet represented, in aggregate, the wages owed to 2,300 people across 14 terminals, a number she could recite from memory the way people recite phone numbers they have called enough times to stop needing to look up. She looked at the key on the chain around her neck. She looked at the clock on the wall. She had called up to reception twice already. She would call 7 more times before the afternoon was over. The man she was calling for was sitting 20 feet above her head, and he was not going to answer the phone. And the building went on around him, around the man in the chair, the way buildings go on. The way the machinery of a place that has decided what it is goes on around anything that doesn't fit its categories. Not with hostility, not with intention, with something harder to address than either of those, with the bland and total absence of attention, with the specific texture of being in a room where every single person has decided, without a meeting, without a vote, without anything you could call a decision, that you are nobody. He was the only one in the room who knew better. The watch on his wrist said 10:23. The leather case sat warm under his palms. In the boardroom behind the frosted doors, 14 people were deep into a quarterly presentation that would be forgotten before the calendar turned. And on the first line of a leather-bound visitor logged 2 floors down, in Darnell Cooper's own handwriting, in small, tight letters, The day had already begun to record itself. He had all the time he needed. He had already decided this. He sat. The second hour is different from the first. The first hour has the quality of a beginning, the specific alertness of a person who has just committed to something and is still running on the energy of the decision. The second hour is when the commitment stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a fact you live inside rather than one you hold at arm's length and examine. Darnell Cooper had been in the third chair for 1 hour and 17 minutes when the second hour began to show him its particular face. And what it showed him was not doubt and not discomfort, but something more precise than either. A kind of clarity. The clarity of a man who has stopped waiting for the situation to change and has begun, instead, to study it. The hallway operated on a rhythm he had mapped without trying to map it. Ashley Thomas at the reception desk cycled through her tasks in patterns that repeated with minor variation every 20 to 30 minutes. Phones, screen work, the occasional person who came off the elevator and either went directly to the glass door with a badge or stopped at the desk and was processed quickly, warmly, efficiently. The boardroom behind the frosted doors maintained its acoustic signature, a steady undertone of presentation and response, punctuated every so often by something that sounded like agreement, and once, around 10:40, by something that sounded like a dispute, resolved too quickly to have been fully resolved. The light from the window at the end of the corridor had moved far enough that it now cut across the floor at a sharper angle, the shadow line precise enough to tell him the time within a few minutes even without the watch. He did not check the watch constantly. He had learned, over years of dispatch work, that the people who check their watches constantly are the people for whom time is an enemy. He had never made that mistake. Time was not his enemy today. Time was his instrument. At 10:54, the elevator opened and a man in a gray suit came off it and crossed to the glass door and badged through without acknowledgement of anything in the waiting area. 3 minutes later, a woman in a green blazer came off the same elevator, was met at the door by someone from inside, and disappeared into the floor in under 90 seconds. At 11:02, a man appeared from inside the glass wall and stood at Ashley's desk and asked her something in a voice too low to carry, and Ashley laughed, briefly and genuinely, and handed him a stack of papers from her printer tray. Life. Continuous, indifferent, competent life. The life of a floor that knew what it was and processed everything through that knowledge at high speed. At 11:20, Sandra Anderson came back through. She had an armful of binders, the large 3-ring kind that contained documents people printed out when they wanted the printing to communicate seriousness. And she was moving at her standard velocity, which was the velocity of a woman who had decided her time was the scarcest resource in any room she occupied. She pulled up short when she saw him because she had, apparently, not fully registered that he would still be there. The brief arrest in her movement lasted less than a second, and then she recovered and kept moving. But the recovery itself was information. She had expected him to be gone. The expectation of his absence was the baseline from which she was operating. You're still here. Not a question. My name is on the first line of the book downstairs. Not an accusation either. Just a fact, delivered in the same register he had used at 9 flat, and without edges, the voice of a man who has already chosen the ground he is standing on and finds it entirely stable. Something moved through her expression that was not quite irritation and not quite surprise, and was not quite either of those things in combination. It was something closer to recalibration, the experience of having a response prepared for a situation and finding that the situation has shifted slightly in a direction the response doesn't cover. Nobody reads the book. That's for the fire marshal. She said it. The way you say things you know are slightly wrong, but that served the immediate purpose. Her heels made a sound on the stone floor as she left that was entirely different from the sound they had made when she arrived. Faster, more precise. The sound of someone who has had an exchange they need to be away from. The quiet that followed was a different quality than the quiet before. It had a shape to it now. A slight pressure, The kind that builds when a room has become aware of something it was not aware of before. Not consciously aware, not in any way it could articulate, but aware in the way spaces become aware of things that don't belong in them, or that it has decided don't belong, which Darnell understood was not the same thing. And then, 11:32. The elevator. The man who came off it was white, mid-30s, wearing a quarter-zip pullover in dark navy and boat shoes that had been expensive enough when purchased that they still communicated money even after the wear they'd accumulated. He carried a phone in his right hand and a laptop bag over his left shoulder, and he moved with the specific ease of someone who had never in his adult life approached an unfamiliar space without some prior claim on it. He did not sign anything downstairs. Raymond Harris had seen his face before and had given him the wave through, 2 fingers lifted from the desk in the greeting of recognized regulars. The man crossed the reception area at full speed, reached the glass door, and paused not to badge through but to make eye contact with Ashley, who looked up from her screens and immediately, visibly, brightened in a way that was qualitatively different from the professional brightness she maintained for strangers. Hey, Ashley was already standing. The ease of it. The total absence of any procedure. She crossed 11 steps of carpeted floor and opened the glass door herself, leaning slightly in to address whoever was nearest on the other side, and from inside the boardroom came a voice that called the man's name, with the warmth of genuine pleasure at a surprise. He was through the door in the time it took the sound of his name to fade. 90 seconds. Elevator to welcome. No book, no badge, no wait. Darnell looked at his father's watch. He noted the time. He noted the specific quality of what had just happened, which was not exceptional by the standards of this floor, but which was, by any standard of honest accounting, a complete and total inversion of how he had been treated since 8:41 that morning. Then he opened the leather case, folded the inside cover back to expose the unlined surface of the flap, uncapped the pen he had brought, and began to write. Not names. He didn't have names for the people he was watching. He wrote times, arrivals, the manner of each arrival, whether the visitor signed anything downstairs, whether they had a badge, how long it took from their appearance at the elevator to their entry into the space behind the glass wall. He built a column, tight, small entries in his own handwriting, the same handwriting that was on the first line of the visitor logged 2 floors down. The entry at 11:34 read in full 11:32. Quarter zip, no book, no badge. 90 seconds floor to handshake. He would add 9 more entries before the afternoon was out. An investigative firm would begin 2 years of forensic reconstruction from that column. It would become, in the language of the final report, a primary source document, evidence generated in real time by the only person in the building who understood exactly what he was watching. He closed the case and set it flat again and put both hands on it. 2 floors below him, the situation with Kathleen Robinson had reached its 3rd hour and had taken on the specific texture of a crisis being managed by someone who is running out of ways to manage it quietly. The payroll file sat complete and verified in front of her, every line checked twice, every terminal report cross-referenced, the authorization sheet waiting at the top of the stack with a space at the bottom for a signature that was currently sitting 20-some feet above her head in a room where nobody knew it was there. She had called reception. She had called the direct line for the corporate group's administrative coordinator. She had called the scheduling line. She had called Darnell's cell and listened to his voicemail message twice without leaving a message, because the second time she recognized that the voicemail message she was about to leave would document something she did not yet have a framework for documenting. She looked at the key on its chain. She thought about the clause. She picked up the phone and dialed the 14th floor again. Ashley answered with the double pulse that identified internal calls. 14th floor, this is Ashley. Kathleen's voice carried the particular kind of controlled urgency that women who have spent decades in institutional settings develop as a survival skill the ability to communicate extreme seriousness without triggering the defensive reactions that extreme seriousness tends to produce in people who have the power to make your life difficult. This is Kathleen Robinson from Payroll. I've called 3 times already. I need to reach Mr. Cooper. He has a 9 o'clock on your floor. Ma'am, I've been here since 8. I don't have anyone by that name checked in. He signed the visitor log downstairs. I know he's in the building. I can check us again. The sounds of typing. The brief pause that meant the screen was being consulted. I'm sorry. I really don't see anyone by that name on the floor. Kathleen set the receiver down without saying goodbye, which was something she had never done in 22 years of professional conduct. And the small breaking of that habit was the first external sign of what the situation was costing her. She looked at the clock. She looked at the file. She calculated the remaining time the way a person calculates the distance to shore when the boat is taking on water. Adequate. Barely. If the signature arrived by 5:30, she would have 12 minutes to process the release before the banks cut it off. 12 minutes was enough. She had done it in 8 on a bad system day. 12 was enough if the signature arrived by 5:30. At 11:50, Robert Williams stepped out of the boardroom to take a phone call. He stood in the hallway 8 feet from the 3rd chair, facing away from it. His voice was the voice of a man comfortable with being overheard. The voice of someone who understood at some subliminal level that volume in a hallway is its own kind of authority. No, we're good. We're wrapping the deck this afternoon, so. A pause. He laughed at something, shifted his weight to its back foot in the easy rocking stance of a man who expects his calls to be interesting.
Yeah, Sandra says we've got a walk-in camped out in the lobby since like 8 this morning, which is...
He paused again, letting the observation find its level. The laugh that came next was brief and genuine and entirely without malice, which made it in some ways worse than malice would have been. No idea. Some guy, 2 words, 8 feet away. Said with the lightness of something that costs nothing because there is no weight attached to it, because the person being described has been assigned to a category that places them outside the range of things that have weight. Darnell heard every syllable. He had been in that position before, the position of being in a room where someone is talking about you in the 3rd person while you are present. The specific experience of being made grammatically absent from a conversation you are physically part of. He had first experienced it at 23, on a call he was not supposed to overhear, and he had understood even then that the grammar of it was the point. Some guy, not someone, a category, an indefinite article attached to a placeholder, something to be explained away in a sentence and then set aside. His hands did not move on the case. The call ended. Robert Williams went back through the frosted doors. The hallway returned to its baseline ambient noise. At 12:15, a catering cart came off the service elevator at the far end of the corridor and was pushed toward the boardroom by a man in kitchen whites who was navigating the turn around a planter with the careful attention of someone operating a vehicle he doesn't entirely trust on an unfamiliar road. 12 lunches under foil lids. A coffee urn, a stack of plates, a tray of cookies with a paper doily under them that had survived the journey from the elevator with its dignity barely intact. The man in kitchen whites was somewhere in his mid-20s, and he navigated the planter, straightened up, and looked across the corridor at the man in the chair. He stopped the cart, not for long enough to do the mental arithmetic of the situation. The man in the chair, the boardroom, the 12 lunches, the 2 extra that logistics had apparently provided as a buffer. You with them, sir? Because I got 2 extra. Plenty to go around. The offer was genuine. It was the kind of offer that comes from someone who has been trained to see practical problems and propose practical solutions. And the practical problem here was a man in a chair and 2 extra lunches on a cart and a simple connection between those 2 things. No assessment, no category, just a person, an observation, and a solution. He's not with the meeting. Sandra Anderson's voice came from the boardroom doorway, where she had appeared at some point in the last 30 seconds without Darnell registering her arrival, and she said it the way you say things you have the authority to say. Flat and final, answering a question that had not been addressed to her in the first place. The man in kitchen whites did not look up again. He pushed the cart through the doorway. The boardroom received its lunch. The doors closed. The smell of hot food is a specific kind of cruelty in a corridor with no windows and no natural circulation. It doesn't leave. It settles into the space and stays there the way certain memories stay. Not dramatic but persistent. A background fact of the environment that you can't unsmell your way out of. Darnell had been sitting in this hallway for 3 hours and 34 minutes. He had eaten a banana before 6 in the morning. The smell of food moved through the air in the corridor, and he registered it the way you register a stimulus you have already decided not to act on, fully and without drama. He did not stand up. He understood by now, had understood it for at least an hour, that the chair was the only physical evidence he had of his own presence. The moment he stood, the chair became available, and the availability of the chair was the building's way of retroactively asserting that he had never quite been there. He would not give the building that. At 1:08, the boardroom door opened and 3 people came out, moving together in the way groups move when they've been sitting for a long time and are grateful for the excuse to use their legs. They went to Ashley's desk. 2 of them had the look of visitors, the slightly less assured quality of people on unfamiliar terrain, and Ashley dealt with them with the specific warmth she deployed for departing guests. The see you next time warmth, the we hope this was valuable warmth. They went to the elevator. The doors closed. The boardroom resumed. At 1:40, a man from building maintenance came off the service elevator with a hand truck and a stack of folded chairs, the aluminum kind with canvas seats that get deployed for overflow seating at large meetings. He navigated the corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved furniture in this building enough times to have learned the angles of every tight corner. He got to the arrangement of chairs outside the boardroom and stopped because one of them was occupied. "Sorry, sir, I need to." He trailed off, looking from the man in the chair to the stack of good chairs he was carrying, running the calculation of how to ask for what he needed without being rude about it. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a name badge that read Gary, and the patient expression of someone who had spent a career encountering unexpected complications, and had long since stopped being surprised by them. Sandra Anderson appeared from the direction of her office, which was behind the glass wall and to the right, and she did not slow her stride or redirect her attention from the phone in her hand. When she said, "Gary, there's space around the corner by the freight elevator. He can wait there." The alcove around the corner from the freight elevator was not a waiting area. It was a service area. Wire shelving holding cleaning supplies. A mop sink with a chemical residue around the drain. A single fluorescent fixture in the ceiling that had developed a flicker somewhere in its ballast that gave everything under it a slightly dissonant quality. Reality stuttering at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance. The smell was industrial cleaner and something beneath that, something older. The specific olfactory record of a space that is used but never considered. Darnell stood up. He picked up his blazer and his case. He walked around the corner into the alcove, and he looked at the folding chair with the bent front leg that someone had placed there at some point and left, and he picked it up, and then he stood in the alcove for a moment with the folding chair in one hand and his case in the other, and he made a decision. He carried the folding chair back around the corner. He walked back down the hallway to the position where the good chair had been. The carpet still held the 4 small depressions where the chair legs had rested. He set the folding chair down in the exact space those 4 depressions defined, aligned to the impressions with the precision of a man who understood that precision in this context was not pedantry but statement. Then he sat down, back straight, blazer across the knees, case on the blazer, both hands flat. Sandra Anderson was standing 20 feet away with her phone down at her side and her expression doing something complicated that her professional training was trying to smooth out and not entirely succeeding. The man had said nothing, had not looked at her once during the entire sequence, had performed the action with a deliberateness so complete that it contained, within its deliberateness, an entire argument she had no procedural response to. She went back to her office. Gary finished stacking the good chairs and wheeled them into the boardroom and did not appear again. At 2:10, the light through the window at the end of the corridor had traveled far enough that the shadow line now crossed the hallway at a different angle, no longer cutting across the floor but climbing the opposite wall, the slow daily migration of light that makes buildings feel, at certain times of the afternoon, like they are aging in real time. Ashley's phone rang. She answered with the version of her voice she used for calls that required management. 14th floor. A pause. Her hand went over the mouthpiece, and when she uncovered it, her voice had taken on the brightness of someone performing ease. I understand. I'll let someone know right away. She hung up and caught Robert Williams on his way past the desk from an internal errand, and her voice dropped to the register of necessary information being delivered at the minimum required volume. Sorry, it's payroll again. They're saying they need a signature by 6 or Friday doesn't process. She sounds pretty worried. Robert Williams did not break stride. He shifted the folder he was carrying from one hand to the other, and his voice had the quality of a line he'd used before. A light managerial deflection so well worn it had become reflex. Payroll solves payroll. That's literally what the role is for. He said it 4 feet from the only set of hands in the building, authorized to sign the release. The thing about a statement like that, delivered that casually, is that it does not feel like a decision when it is being made. It feels like a reasonable observation about institutional function. Payroll has a payroll director. The payroll director manages payroll issues. This is the division of responsibility that makes organizations work. Robert Williams believed this. He believed it completely, with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never been placed in a position where the logic of institutional function failed to protect him, which is different from the statement being right, which is what the next several months were going to demonstrate. Darnell heard it. He added nothing to the column in the leather case. The moment didn't require documentation. It required only witnessing. At 2:36, people on the 14th floor joined a group text. The chat was called 14. It had been active for 11 months. Darnell Cooper would not know about this chat for 12 more days. When he learned about it, he would read it in a summary prepared by an outside investigative firm, which had obtained the full transcript through the discovery process. And reading it would be one of the few moments of the subsequent period that he would need to take a minute before continuing. Sandra Anderson posted the first message. It was a photograph taken through the glass wall, the angle slightly downward, catching the back of a man's head and one shoulder, and the corner of a folding chair, and a pair of hands visible at the bottom of the frame, resting flat on a leather case. And then, still here, 6 hours. The responses arrived over the next 4 minutes. He brought a folder. Which okay, mood. Someone give the man a mop. Let him feel useful. The one that traveled fastest when the transcript became public was posted at 2:34 and read, I'm deceased. Deceased with a period, because that's funnier. 6 adults with corporate titles. 430 messages across 11 months. And in the 9 hours of this particular Thursday, not one of them typed the 3 words, who is he? This is the part that people who read about what happened next get angry about first. Not the chair, not the food, not the walking past, not the coat. The 3 words. The total, complete, structurally guaranteed absence of those 3 words from a chat between 6 people who had been watching a man sit in their lobby since 8 in the morning. Because those 3 words would have required them to conceptualize the man in the chair as a person with a specific identity rather than a categorical representative of the type of person who sits in lobbies without being invited and waits longer than is reasonable. And the building had taught them that the type is not a person with a specific identity. The type is a type, and types don't have answers to 3-word questions. They have dispositions. They have the disposition to wait and eventually to leave. and that is the full extent of what the building needed to understand about them. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Darnell Cooper looked at his father's watch and made a calculation. He had known since the early afternoon that the pressure point would come in the late afternoon. The bank processed the payroll release at 6 o'clock. Kathleen Robinson needed 12 minutes minimum to execute the release. Once the signed authorization was in hand, that meant the signature needed to be delivered no later than 5:48. He knew exactly where Kathleen was and exactly why she could not come to him, because the clause that kept her in the payroll room was the same clause he had declined to eliminate for 3 consecutive years over the formal objection of every operational consultant who had ever reviewed his back-office procedures. He had been carrying the weight of that particular irony since around 11 in the morning, when he had worked out the geometry of it while watching the catering cart go past. He set his internal clock to 5:30. If by 5:30 no one in this building had done the ordinary thing, had asked a question, opened a door, made a phone call driven by something other than their own immediate interest, he would end the experiment. Phone out of his pocket. One call. Signature on the sheet. 2,300 people's wages protected. He was not gambling with the paychecks of 2,300 people. He understood this with complete clarity, and he wanted to make certain the record, even the internal record, was clear on this point. The experiment had a hard wall, and the hard wall was 5:30, and behind that wall was the uncompromising arithmetic of what those 2,300 people were owed and when they were owed it. He was gambling with exactly one thing, and that thing was the question he had driven 2 miles from Renner Yard at 6:30 in the morning to answer. What does this building do when the person in the chair isn't nobody? The watch read 3:0. He had 2.5 hours. He adjusted his weight slightly in the folding chair, the chair with the bent front leg that made it list very slightly to the left, a list so subtle you wouldn't notice it unless you had been sitting in it for 6 hours and had developed an intimate knowledge of its particular geometry. He straightened, both hands flat. At 3:12 in the afternoon, the elevator opened. Raymond Harris stepped off it. He was in his uniform because he had not stopped to change, though his shift technically permitted a jacket break at this hour. He was carrying a bottle of water. Not a cup, a bottle from the small cooler he kept behind his desk. The kind of personal accommodation to the length of a shift that you make when you are 63 years old and your body has opinions about hydration that it did not have at 40. The bottle was still cold. The label was damp with condensation. He crossed the corridor without stopping at the reception desk. Ashley watched him make this crossing with the specific quality of attention you give to something that is happening outside the normal parameters of how things happen. Not alarm, just attention. Raymond Harris came to the third chair, and then he did something that no one else in this building had done or was going to do for another 2 hours and 23 minutes. He crouched down. His knees produced a sound that carried in the quiet of the corridor, a dry pop that he absorbed without acknowledgement, and he got himself down to eye level with the man in the chair so that what followed would not be a conversation conducted from above. "You've been up here a while." "I have." Raymond held out the bottle of water. He didn't ask whether the man wanted it. He just extended it and held it there until it was taken, which it was, with both hands, and the action of receiving it with both hands said something about what the previous 6 hours had cost that Darnell Cooper's expression and posture and voice had been entirely unwilling to say. "Did they feed you?" "No." "What's your name?" The question was so simple that it required a moment to settle. Not because it was unexpected, but because it had not been asked in 6 hours by 400 people. And simplicity that has been absent long enough begins to feel when it arrives, almost impossible in its plainness. Darnell looked at him for 1 second longer than the question required, and then he said, "Darnell." Raymond Harris nodded. Twice. Slowly. The nod of a man turning something over in his chest that is too large for his chest, but that he is going to find room for regardless. "I can knock on that door right now." "I'll do it right now. You want me to?" "No. Thank you." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." Raymond got back to his feet. The process of rising took longer than the process of crouching had, which is one of the specific indignities of being 63, that gravity takes you down faster than it lets you come back up. He put one hand on the small of his back, and he looked at the frosted glass door of the boardroom, and his face did something then, a shift in expression that moved through him, like weather moving through a landscape, unhurried and complete. And whatever he had decided in that moment was something private enough that he didn't offer it. He said, "All right, but I'm going to write down that you're still up here." He went back to the elevator. Downstairs, he opened the visitor log to the day's page, found the entry column, and in the notes field beside the entry that read guest 23. In his own blue ballpoint, in the neat and practiced handwriting of a man who took his records seriously, he wrote 3:14 p.m. Guest 23, still on 14, no escort advised. 3 words that were not questions, 11 words that were not accusations. A log entry made by a man who had been keeping accurate arts logs for over years in a building that had never once thought to read them. And this is the part where you need to sit with what Raymond Harris was. Not in the story. In reality, he was 63 years old, and he had a supervisory chain above him that included people who could make his working life significantly more difficult if he created problems on their floor. He had no connection to the man in the chair, no relationship, no reason. He had a badge log that told him guest 23 had gone up at 8:41 in the morning and had not come back down. He had worked this desk for 11 years. He had never let a badge sit out past 6 hours without going up to check on the person wearing it. That was the entire reason. That was the whole of it. The obligation he had to his own record-keeping exceeded the calculation of what it might cost him to make it. Not because he was noble in any self-conscious way, but because he had built the habit of the thing, and the habit had become the thing, and the thing was what he was. The most important people in systems are almost never the people systems know about. They are the people who have decided, without announcement and without recognition, that their small part of the record is going to be accurate, no matter what. At 4:15, Sandra Anderson came out of the glass door with her coat already over her arm, which was information about the hour and about her plans for it. She stopped when she saw the man still in the third chair, or rather, in the chair that occupied the space where the third chair had been, the folding chair with the bent front leg that now carried 6.5 hours of a man's deliberate waiting. We're wrapping up. He has a client walkthrough at 5:30. My appointment was at 9 o'clock. It's 4:15. She said this with the smile of someone delivering news they consider self-explanatory. And then she added, slowly, with the patience of someone explaining a road closure to a tourist who is confused about why they can't go the way they want to go, sir. Take the hint. He looked at her with the same expression he had maintained since 9:00 in the morning, which was no particular expression, which was the expression of a man whose face has decided to tell the room nothing except that it is present and paying attention. She went back inside. He did not move. At 4:53, Robert Williams came out of the boardroom with his overcoat over his arm and a looseness in his posture that indicated the afternoon had concluded satisfactorily from his perspective. A catering cart followed him out, pushed by the same young man who had offered the extra lunches 4 hours ago. The cart now stacked with the aftermath of a working lunch, crumpled foil, stacked plates, the structured collapse of a meal that had been consumed by people who had not been hungry when it arrived. Sandra Anderson stopped the cart with one hand and lifted the top tray off it, plates and utensils, and the remnant of someone's dessert, and set it on the floor in front of the folding chair with a directness that was impossible to misread as accidental. Kitchens by the freight elevator. Be a dear. And then Robert Williams dropped his overcoat across Darnell Cooper's lap. Hold this for me. He said it the way you say it to a valet, to a coat rack, to any object that happens to occupy the spatial position of something that can hold a coat. He said it without looking at the man's face. He had not looked at the man's face all day. He had not looked at it because he had never looked at it, because he had never, at any point in the preceding 8 hours, conceptualized the man in the chair as a person at whom one might direct one's gaze. A phone produced a flash. 40 seconds later, the photograph appeared in a group text. 3 laughing face emojis followed it within 90 seconds. The full transcript of those 90 seconds would become, 11 months later, one of the most read documents in a proceeding that generated more than 4,000 pages of discovery material. Darnell Cooper picked up the overcoat. He folded it along its natural seam, the seam that runs from shoulder to hem on a properly constructed garment, folded the collar in because a collar folded out gets damaged at the points, folded it the way his mother had taught him to fold a dress coat when he was 9 years old, the way you treat something that belongs to someone else, with more care than you would give your own. He set it on the empty chair beside him. He did not speak. He did not look at Robert Williams. He looked at the frosted doors. At 5:11 in the afternoon, Sandra Anderson picked up the building phone at the reception desk. "Hi, yes. There's a man in our lobby who has been here all day and is refusing to leave. Can someone come up and walk him out?" Darnell Cooper shifted his weight forward in the folding chair. He put both hands flat on the leather case. He was preparing to stand. It was 5:11. He had 19 minutes left in the window he had set for himself at 3 o'clock. But he had had his answer since approximately noon. The 19 minutes were not going to change what the answer was. They were just minutes. And he had run out of reasons to spend them here. He was halfway through the motion of standing when he heard the chime behind him. The elevator. He did not complete the motion. He settled back into the chair. He straightened, both hands flat on the case. His father's watch read 5:11. He gave the building its 19 minutes. Not because he thought those 19 minutes would produce a different result. He had the result. The result was in a leather case, and in a column of handwritten entries, and in the accumulated evidence of an entire workday witnessed from a folding chair, with a bent front leg in a corridor that had not, in 9 hours, asked him his full name. He gave the building its 19 minutes because the elevator had chimed. And the only person in this building who had treated him as though his name might matter was on his way up. And Raymond Harris deserved to see how the day ended. Raymond Harris walked off that elevator like a man who had already decided something. Not on the ride up. Earlier, maybe at 3:14 when he wrote those 11 words in the notes column and straightened up and felt the specific weight of what he'd written settle into him as he rode back down. Maybe during the hours between that visit and this one, hours he'd spent at his desk in the lobby, watching the badge log and watching the clock and watching the particular arithmetic of a situation that was adding up to something he recognized even if he couldn't have named it yet. He came off the elevator and he read the room with the competence of a man who had been reading rooms from this position for 11 years, and what the room showed him stopped him for exactly 3 seconds before he moved. The folding chair, still there, the man in it, back straight, both hands flat, as though the 9 hours between 8:41 and 5:11 had not touched the posture at all. The tray on the floor with its stack of plates, and the fork lying beside it at the angle of something set down carelessly. The overcoat on the adjacent chair, folded with a precision that was its own kind of statement. Sandra Anderson with the building phone still in her hand, the call placed, the request made, the machinery of removal already in motion. And behind all of it, behind the frosted glass, the shape of Robert Williams moving in the boardroom with a glass in his hand, and the loose-shouldered quality of a man whose afternoon had gone the way he wanted it to go. Raymond took all of this in during those 3 seconds. Then he crossed the corridor. "Ma'am." His voice was the voice he used when something needed to be said clearly and without room for interpretation. This man signed in. 9 o'clock. First line this morning. I have it downstairs. Sandra Anderson had been in this building long enough to have developed a finely calibrated sense of which employees she needed to manage and which she could simply redirect. Raymond Harris occupied a specific position in that taxonomy, a position she had not needed to examine closely until this moment, because he had never before inserted himself into a situation on her floor. She recalibrated now, quickly. and the recalibration was visible in the quality of her pause before she spoke. I don't care what the book says. Raymond did not move. It's the same book everyone signs. Maybe you shouldn't have a book to write in, she said it slowly, deliberately. And then she looked at him with the specific look of someone who has decided to make a point with a name. What's your name? He told her. She typed it into her phone in front of him, every letter, slowly. She turned the screen so he could watch each character appear, which was not technically a threat, which was also not technically anything other than a threat. Robert Williams came out of the boardroom. Then, with his tie loosened by 1 full inch from where it had been at 9 that morning, and a glass of something amber in his hand, because the client walkthrough had converted, as these things sometimes do, into a working celebration of itself. He assessed the situation at the elevator bank with the quick competence of a man used to reading group dynamics and said, "What's the holdup? What's happening here?" Security has opinions. Sandra's voice had gone to the register of someone performing patience for an audience. Raymond Harris, sir. The man is signed in. First line. 8:41 this morning. And Robert Williams put his hand on Raymond's shoulder. The hand was friendly, heavy. The hand of someone who touches people to communicate a hierarchy that the words alone might not carry efficiently. Come on, buddy. Nobody's been sitting out here all day. That doesn't happen in my building. He was looking directly at Darnell Cooper when he said the word nobody, and in that moment, in the specific texture of that moment, Darnell understood that this was the line. Not because it was the worst thing said to him today. It wasn't. It was not even the most specific, but it was the one said while looking at him. The others had been said around him, past him, about him, in his hearing. This one was said to his face, with eye contact, with the word nobody landing in the space between two human beings who could see each other clearly, which made it something different from the rest of the day's inventory, which made it the one that would matter most in the room with the court reporter, which Robert Williams did not know yet but would. Darnell Cooper stood up, not fast, not with the sudden vertical movement of a man who has been provoked into reaction. He rose the way things rise when they have been given enough time to accumulate gravity. 6 feet 2 inches in flat boots, and he came up slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has been deciding for 9 hours exactly how he would stand when he finally stood. And both Robert Williams and Sandra Anderson stepped back a half step without deciding to. The involuntary retreat of bodies responding to something the brain has not yet processed as information. I want the visitor book from the front desk. His voice was the same voice, the same flat, unhurried, edgeless voice that had said 9 o'clock to Raymond Harris at 8:41 this morning, that had said my name is on the first line to Sandra Anderson at 11:20, that had said no thank you to Raymond's offer to knock on the door at 3:12. The same voice, not a decibel louder, not a degree warmer or colder, simply present, the original. Not a scan, not a photograph. Oh my God, are you serious right now? Sandra's voice had gone up a half register into the tone of someone performing disbelief for an audience of themselves. The change history on today's calendar for Robert Williams. He turned to Ashley, who was at her desk, with the quality of stillness that comes over people when they are in the presence of something whose nature they have not yet determined, but that is clearly significant. Pull the full history. Not the current display. Every change. Time-stamped. Ashley's hands were already at her keyboard. Because whatever else was happening, the instruction was specific and operational, and she was someone who responded to operational specificity. She typed. Her eyes went across the screen. She typed again. A different sequence, accessing the audit trail that the scheduling system maintained automatically, and that almost no one ever accessed, because almost no one ever needed to look at how an appointment had arrived at its current state. And then the elevator chimed again. The doors opened. Kathleen Robinson had not run. She was 58 years old and 4 feet 11 in shoes, and she had spent the last hour and 43 minutes in a windowless room on the 12th floor cycling through every avenue available to her and finding each one blocked or wrong or inadequate. And what she had done instead of running was make a decision that cost her something, which is more sustainable than running and more permanent in its consequences. She had closed the payroll file. She had put the key from the chain around her neck into the lock of the filing cabinet. She had locked it. She had picked up her bag. And she had walked out of a room she had not left during business hours on a release day in 22 years. The bylaw said the verifying officer does not leave the room containing the payroll file on a release day. She had left the room. She had left it because the alternative was watching 2,300 people not get paid on Friday, and 22 years of processing those 2,300 people's wages had made that alternative feel like the kind of failure that does not have a redemption arc. Whatever the bylaw said, whatever the procedural cost, she had left the room. The elevator opened on 14 and she stepped out and she saw him 18 feet from the boardroom door, standing, folded coat on the chair beside him. Two people standing at a slight backward angle from him, with the body language of a conversation that has just changed its nature fundamentally. The folding chair with the bent front leg, the tray on the floor. 22 years. She had processed his time cards when he was 22 years old, doing night dispatch in the portable building at Renner Yard. And she had seen him once, at 2 in the morning in that building's break room, annotating a freight document in pencil. And she had thought something then that she had kept to herself. She would have known the line of his shoulders from across a parking lot in the dark. Mr. Cooper, the temperature in that hallway changed. Not metaphorically. The air in the corridor shifted in the specific way. Air shifts when the information a room is carrying suddenly exceeds the room's capacity to hold it without releasing some of it as heat. Kathleen Robinson did not slow down as she crossed those 18 feet. She did not take inventory of the people present, or the quality of the situation, or the various dynamics that a person with better information might have taken a moment to assess. She had 22 minutes. She had been trying to reach this man for 6 hours and 51 minutes. She had left a room she was not supposed to leave on a release day. She had run out of the kind of time that allows for careful navigation. Thank God. Sir, I have called 9 times. I called your cell. They kept telling me you weren't in the building. Her voice cracked at the syllable weren't, and she went straight through the crack without stopping because she was 58 years old. And she had been carrying the weight of this situation alone in a windowless room for the better part of a workday, and she had nothing left to spend on composure. The file is built. Controller verified at 11. I need your signature or the cutoff kills Friday's release. 2,300 people. She had the authorization sheet in her hand. She had carried it up with her, the single page with the verification grid, and the signature line at the bottom, and the timestamp running along the right margin that would tell the bank exactly when the authorization had been executed, and whether it fell inside or outside the processing window. Darnell took it from her. He looked at the page for a moment, not reading it. He knew what it said. He had seen this page 41 times before today, each time in the quiet of his office at Renner Yard, with the dock sounds coming through the window. He looked at it now, in a 14th floor corridor, over a tray of dirty plates, and a folding chair with a bent front leg, while 2 people who had spent 9 hours deciding he was nobody stood behind him at a half-step's distance and didn't breathe. He set the authorization sheet on the seat of the folding chair, flat, pressed one hand to the top edge to hold it against the slight corridor draft, and he signed his name, D. Cooper. The same signature. The same small, tight letters, the same controlled pen pressure, the signature that lived on a plate in a gray steel cabinet in the basement and printed at the bottom of every check that came out of this building, the signature that had appeared on 68 pay authorizations since he acquired this company, and that no one on the 14th floor had ever thought to look at closely enough to ask what hand it came from. 5:44 in the afternoon. He handed the sheet back to Kathleen Robinson. Go. You have 16 minutes, she went. The elevator doors closed on the sound of her saying, thank you, in the voice of someone who has been operating for several hours at the outer limit of what they are able to manage. The voice of someone who is going to go do the thing that needs to be done and then find a quiet place to sit in. And then it was 4 people in a hallway. Darnell, Robert Williams, Sandra Anderson, Ashley Thomas, still at her desk, not pretending to work. The tray on the floor, the folding chair. The overcoat folded on the adjacent seat. "I'm sorry. Who is he?" Sandra's voice had the quality of a question that the person asking already knows is the wrong question, and is asking anyway, because the alternative is to stand in silence while the room reshapes itself around information she has not yet processed. Robert Williams answered before Darnell could. "I mean, obviously there's been a..." He stopped, started again. This is a miscommunication. This is clearly a breakdown in scheduling communication, and I want to make sure we're treating it as..." He stopped again, because the math had caught up with him. The math of Kathleen Robinson appearing on his floor. The math of her calling him Mr. Cooper. The math of the authorization sheet and the signature and the specific quality of Kathleen Robinson's voice. When she had said 2,300 people, the voice of someone reporting to their employer, not pleading with a stranger. "Who is he?" Sandra asked again. Kathleen Robinson had already gone back through the elevator doors. The question was going to have to be answered by someone else. Ashley answered it first because she had her computer, and her computer had audit trails, and audit trails, unlike the humans in this hallway, did not make interpretive decisions about who deserved to be looked up. "Ashley, pull the full profile on the authorization signatory for this quarter's payroll releases." Darnell said it without looking away from Robert Williams. He said it with the quality of a man issuing instructions to someone he trusts to execute them accurately, which is how he spoke to everyone who worked for him, and how he had spoken to every person at Bridgepoint Freight for 3 years, even though not one of them knew that's what they were. Ashley pulled it. Her face went white, not suddenly, in stages, beginning at the hairline and descending, the slow draining of color from a face that is processing the distance between what it understood to be true and what the screen is showing it to be true. Bridgepoint Freight Systems. Authorized signatory of record, D. Cooper. She looked at the entry dates. He's been on every release authorization for 3 years. The silence in that hallway had a specific character now. It was not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of a room in which something has already happened and the occupants are still catching up to it. "That's not..." Robert Williams started the sentence and left it unfinished because the ending he'd had prepared for it had just become unavailable to him. Darnell took his phone out of his blazer pocket for the first time since 8:30 that morning. The screen showed 11 missed calls, 7 from a number he recognized as Kathleen's desk line, 2 from her cell, and 2 from a number assigned to the corporate scheduling coordinator. He did not look at the calls. He opened his contacts and dialed Laura Clark. "Laura, I'm on 14. I need you to do 3 things right now. Freeze the badge log and the full calendar audit trail for today before anyone in this building has the idea that they should be managing something. Get the visitor book from Raymond's desk, the original, by hand. Bring it upstairs. And call Ellen at home. Tell her tonight." He listened for 2 seconds. "I know what time it is. Tell her tonight." He put the phone back in his pocket. Robert Williams said, "Mr. Cooper, listen. There's clearly been a..." He was on his 3rd attempt at the same sentence, and the sentence kept failing him in the same place, at the word that was supposed to minimize the distance between where they were and where things were supposed to be. A failure of process here. A communication issue. And I want you to know that this floor operates at a standard that absolutely does not. Ashley. Darnell finally turned away from Robert Williams. He turned to Ashley Thomas, who was behind her desk with the expression of someone who has spent the day as a participant in something she is only now understanding the full shape of. What time was the 9 o'clock appointment on today's calendar changed to hold? Ashley looked at the change history that was still on her screen, still time-stamped, still fully legible. The audit trail that the scheduling system had been quietly maintaining all day without anyone thinking about it. 8:52. Her voice was careful in the way voices are careful when they are reading something that they understand has consequences. Changed to hold at 8:52. The note in the field says, She stopped, looked at the screen again, made herself finish. Walk in. No title. 8:52 in the morning. 11 minutes after a man had written his name on the first line of a leather-bound visitor log in the lobby. 11 minutes into a workday that had not yet begun in any meaningful sense for anyone on this floor, except the person who had looked at the camera feed downstairs and made a decision about what the man at the desk represented before she had spoken a word to him. Darnell turned to Sandra Anderson. At 8:52, my name was on your screen. You changed the status and typed a description in the note field. He said it without heat, without the performance of anger. He said it the way you say something you want the room to understand is not an accusation but a fact, and that the distinction matters. What the description said is now in the record. What the time says is now in the record. Sandra Anderson stood with the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at the outer boundary of what their professional training can manage and has nothing left to deploy. Her face was doing something complex, not guilt, or not only guilt, but the specific experience of having understood something about yourself that you did not understand before, and that does not leave room for the kind of maneuvering you normally rely on. Robert Williams began again. He had found a new angle. He said that he had been in a quarterly review from 9:15 straight through. He said the calendar was not a function he personally managed. He said that Sandra administered the calendar, and that was the specific reason the role existed. He said that if an appointment had been moved at 8:52, that decision had not involved him, and he wanted that on the record, and it would be important to be clear about that in any subsequent review of today's events, because there was a meaningful difference between a decision made by the division president and a decision made by an administrative function without his knowledge, and every word of that was true. That was the particular trouble with it. Robert Williams had not been at his computer at 8:52. He had not changed the calendar entry. He had not typed the words "walk in" and no title into a note field. He had not made the decision that landed the first domino in the sequence this day had become. Every word he said in his own defense was accurate, and the problem, the deep structural problem that no amount of accurate self-defense could address, was that the accuracy of his innocence in that specific moment did not change the fact of what he had done with the rest of the day. He had been 4 feet from the chair when he almost said something at 9:11 and let his phone pull him away. He had been 8 feet from the chair at 11:50 and had described the man in it as some guy to someone on a phone call, while that man sat close enough to hear his own description. He had walked past that chair 11 times between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. He had never once asked the question, the 3-word question, the question that would have cost him less than 90 seconds, and that had simply, completely never occurred to him, not because he was malicious, because the man in the chair had not registered as the kind of person the question gets asked about. And that decision, the decision to not see, had been his. It had been his every single time. Sandra Anderson looked at Robert Williams, and she said it the way you say something you know cannot be unsaid, and that you are saying anyway because the alternative is standing in a hallway while someone else carries weight that does not entirely belong to them. You said let him sit. 8:50 this morning. Before I opened anything, before anyone checked anything, you looked at the security camera feed and you said let him sit. I want to see how long he lasts. 9 words, under 3 seconds, delivered without drama, without elevation of voice, without any of the staging that statements of this magnitude usually carry. Just 9 words and then silence. No one in that hallway would ever forget the specific sound of a woman handing over the man she was engaged to with the quiet efficiency of someone who has calculated that the alternative is worse. Robert Williams did not respond. There was nothing available for him to say. The 9 words had arrived in the hallway with the weight of something that had been true since 8:50 in the morning, and that the hallway was now simply being asked to hold. Darnell Cooper looked at both of them. He looked at them with the same level of attention he had directed at everything in this building since he walked through its front doors. The attention of a man who is gathering information and knows that information gathered in haste is information with errors in it. You're both suspended effective right now, pending an outside investigation. Don't touch your phones except to surrender them to counsel. Don't delete anything. Don't send a single message to anyone in this building tonight. He looked at the desk. Badges on the counter. They put their badges on the counter. They did it separately, with the specific quality of people performing an action that they are experiencing as surreal, the quality of a body complying with instructions, while the mind is still trying to locate the moment when the situation became one in which this was what compliance looked like. Robert Williams set his badge down with the careful placement of someone who is being very deliberate about not slamming it. Sandra Anderson set hers down without looking at where she was setting it. They went to the elevator. They stood in it together, not speaking, not looking at each other, and the doors closed. Downstairs, Raymond Harris had the visitor log open on the desk. He saw them come off the elevator and he slid the book across without being asked. The same motion he made 400 times a week, automatic and complete. Everyone leaving after hours signs out. Robert Williams picked up the pen. He signed his name in a visitor book, in a building he had run for 4 years, on his way out of that building for the last time in any capacity that mattered. And Raymond Harris wrote the time in the column beside it, 6:11. He did not look up. Upstairs, the tray was still on the floor where it had been placed. Darnell looked at it. He looked at the fork on the carpet beside it. He looked at the folding chair. He took out his phone and called the number for the building's facilities line. And when someone answered, he said, "The tray on 14, outside the main boardroom. Leave it exactly where it is. Don't move it. Don't touch it. Don't let cleaning get to it tonight." The person on the other end said, "Yes, sir," in the voice of someone who has learned not to ask follow-up questions when the tone of an instruction contains its own explanation. The tray sat there overnight under the corridor light that never gets switched off, with the fork beside it on the carpet, at the angle of something set down by someone who was making a point rather than placing an object. An investigative photographer documented it the next morning from 4 positions, with a ruler in the frame for scale. The resulting photographs became Exhibit 2 in the final report. Exhibit 1 was a page from a leather-bound visitor log. Together, they told the first page of a story that took 2 years to finish reading. At 5:58 in the afternoon, 2 floors below, and with 2 minutes to spare before the bank's processing cutoff, Kathleen Robinson executed the payroll release. Her hands were steady. Her face, had anyone been in the room with her to observe it, would have shown the expression of someone completing a task they came very close to not being able to complete, and who has decided not to think about how close until the task is finished. She pressed the confirmation sequence. The system logged the timestamp. The bank received the file. 2,300 people would be paid on Friday. Not one of them would know how close it had come. Not one of them would know that the margin between ordinary Friday and a Friday with no deposits had been measured in minutes, and that those minutes had been secured by a 58-year-old woman who walked out of a room she was not supposed to leave because 22 years of knowing what the number at the bottom of that file represented had made the alternative unthinkable. The investigation took 12 days to complete its first phase and 2 years to complete its full scope. The outside firm began with the visitor log, which Raymond Harris surrendered without being asked, because he had been keeping it accurately for 11 years, and the idea that an accurate record should be withheld from a legitimate inquiry was not a concept his understanding of his own job had room for. He surrendered the badge return log as well. The secondary record he maintained in a separate column of his personal desk notebook. The record of every badge number issued versus every badge returned. The record he had kept without instructions and without recognition, because the alternative was not having the record, and not having the record was the same as not doing the job. The firm found the business card in his desk drawer on day 3. It had been there for 16 months, tucked in the back of the drawer, behind a stack of spare badge clips, and no one had thrown it away, because no one had known what to do with it, and things you don't know what to do with accumulate in the backs of desk drawers until someone makes a decision about them. The card belonged to a woman who ran a freight brokerage in the next county. She had a confirmed appointment on 14. She had waited 6 hours and 30 minutes. She had asked Raymond for a pen, written something on the back of the card with it, and left the card on the counter, and gone home without making a scene, and without filing a complaint, and without leaving her name in any system that the building maintained, because she had understood from the 6.5 hours of evidence that this was not a building that processed complaints from people who looked like her through channels that would reach people who could act on them. She had written 2 words on the back of the card. The investigators found them when they turned the card over. I understand when they reached her by phone, she said she didn't want to be involved. She said she wasn't interested in becoming a story. She said she just wanted to know whether anyone had ever actually read the card. The investigator told her that yes, they had read it, and there was a pause on the line that lasted several seconds. And the investigator noted in his working file that he could not determine from the quality of the pause whether the information was comforting. The visitor log covered 2 years. 94 visitors with confirmed appointments to the 14th floor. 19 of those visitors were never collected. Not delayed, not rescheduled, never. They sat for an average of 4 hours and 9 minutes, and then they went to the elevator, and they returned to the badges to Raymond Harris's desk, the numbered clip badges, and Raymond wrote the time of return in his column, and they left. The average collection time for visitors who were actually brought into the boardroom was 6 minutes. 6 minutes versus 4 hours and 9 minutes. The variance was not random. 16 of the 19 were Black or Latino. Raymond had flagged 11 of them in his notes column with the same word he'd used at 3:14 on the Thursday of Darnell Cooper's visit. Advised. 11 entries over 2 years. The word meaning, I went up, I checked. I was there when this person needed someone to be there. No one on the 14th floor had come downstairs in 11 years to ask him what that word meant in his log. Not once. The pattern extended across the full 2 years of Raymond's consistent record-keeping, and those 2 years fell entirely within Darnell Cooper's period of ownership. This was the part of the report that people who read it tended to skip or to read and then set aside, because it was uncomfortable in a way that the story of the single Thursday was not. The Thursday had villains and a resolution and a clarity of causation. The 2 years had something harder. The 2 years had a structure, a pattern built from small decisions made by multiple people over a sustained period inside a system that the person who owned the system had not looked at. The lead investigator raised it directly on day 8. It was framed as a scoping question, the careful phrasing of someone who is doing their job without prejudging the person they're doing it for. How far back do you want us to go? There is a note in the working file that says the answer took a while, that Darnell Cooper sat with the question for long enough that the investigator began to wonder whether he'd heard it. And then he said, all of it. His counsel raised the liability implications immediately. You do not hand active plaintiffs a document in which the owner of the company acknowledges that the pattern they are claiming damages for predates the specific employees he terminated. You do not put that in a public report. You redact page 9. You redact it and you proceed, because proceeding is what you can do. He printed it unredacted, page 9. The full 2 years. The note in his own handwriting in the margin, added after he read the draft and before he sent it to print, that said, the letters came 5 months before I got in the truck. 5 months is also a number someone could put in a report. The phones took longer because the discovery process has its own pace. But when the chat transcript arrived, it became the document that traveled fastest and farthest because it did not require a lawyer to interpret, and it did not require footnotes. 430 messages across 11 months. The nicknames. The running category joke. The thing they called clipboards. A term whose specific meaning became clear only in the context of who the chat's participants tended to apply it to when describing visitors to their floor. The photograph from 2:30 with its 3 laughing emojis. On day 6, Sandra Anderson gave a sworn statement with counsel present, and surrendered the complete record. The calendar entry, the note field, the 8:52 timestamp, the chair, the tray, the photograph, the 9 words she'd said in the hallway. She gave all of it without being asked twice about any individual piece. She was, her counsel noted afterward, remarkably forthcoming, with the quality of someone for whom the maintenance of a specific internal account of events had become more costly than the disclosure of those events. Whatever she had been telling herself about the shape of that day, the act of telling it under oath had clarified something she apparently needed clarified. Robert Williams set forth his deposition on day 9. His attorney had prepared him well for most of it. He held up through the timeline questions and through the documentation of what had been said to him by various parties during the day, and through the chat transcript, questions that had been anticipated and answered by reference to context and culture and the specific norms of informal communication in a high-pressure work environment. He came apart at 2 words. His counsel read them back from a witness statement, without framing, without context. Just the 2 words as they had been spoken into a phone at 11:50 in the morning at a volume audible to everyone in a quiet corridor. Some guy. A pause. Who did you believe he was? Robert Williams did not have an answer. Not a bad one, not a strategic one, not even an inadequate one that he could have retreated behind. He had no answer because in 9 hours, he had not spent a single moment of cognitive effort on the question of who the man in the folding chair might be. The man had arrived in a category, and the category had answered every question the category could answer. And the question of whether the category was accurate had simply, entirely, never been generated. The deposition transcript documents the pause. It describes the pause as lasting approximately 45 seconds. Which in a deposition room is an interval of specific weight. Then his counsels asked the follow-up. If you had known who he was, would he have waited? Robert Williams answered in a single syllable, quickly, before whatever mechanism usually intercepts statements of this kind could engage. No, 1 syllable. Alone on a line of a court reporter's transcript. The most expensive word he would ever speak, in the specific legal sense of expense. And also, though he would not understand this for some time, in the more durable sense as well. The board of Bridgepoint Freight Systems convened on day 12. The boardroom with the frosted doors held more people than it had ever held during Darnell Cooper's 3 years of ownership. Terminal managers had driven in from 4 states, some of them taking personal days, some of them logging the trip as business travel, and willing to justify that classification to anyone who asked. Drivers who were off shift came in wearing shirts they'd pressed for the occasion, standing along the back wall because the chairs filled before they arrived, holding their caps in their hands with the specific quality of men who have been asked to witness something and have decided to witness it properly. Kathleen Robinson sat in the 2nd row. The key on its chain was outside her cardigan for the first time anyone in that room had seen, resting against the fabric in plain view, which was the only external signal she gave that this day was different from other days. The first item on the agenda was not a motion, and it was not a resolution, and it was not a presentation. It was a reading. Darnell Cooper asked Raymond Harris to come to the front of the room, and Raymond came forward with the visitor log under his arm and his reading glasses down from his forehead to his nose. For the occasion, and he opened the book to the Thursday page, and he read the 19 entries: name, date, time of arrival, badge number assigned, time of badge returned to the desk. For each of the 19, the full record, read aloud in a quiet boardroom where no one moved. It took 9 minutes. The drivers along the back wall did not shift their weight. The terminal managers in the chairs did not check their phones. When Raymond reached the entry that read D. Cooper, 90R Williams, arrived at 8:41, badge guest 23. A man at the far back of the room said, "Oh my God," in the voice of someone whose understanding of a situation has just reorganized itself completely. He said it at full volume into a room that was otherwise silent, and Raymond Harris did not stop reading, because there were 4 more names after that one, and those 4 names deserved the same reading the first 15 had received. Robert Williams was terminated for cause, which eliminated his severance package and a stock award that had vested 40% of the way through its 3-year schedule, and that would not complete. It also ended his candidacy for an industry association board seat he had been campaigning for since the previous spring through a network of relationships he would now need to manage differently. The company exercised the clawback provision on his prior year performance bonus, and he did not contest it, because contesting it required a hearing, and a hearing meant introducing the full deposition transcript into a room with more people in it. And the transcript contained a syllable alone on a line that he had spent the intervening days trying to stop thinking about. Sandra Anderson was terminated the same afternoon. 3 of the 19 visitors to the 14th floor filed civil rights complaints once the report became public, and Darnell Cooper gave his counsel the briefest instruction of his professional relationship with her. Don't fight any of them. Pay what they're owed. Write the apology in plain language. Put my name on it. He stood in the boardroom after the votes and the resolutions and the procedural business were concluded, and he held the 3 unsigned letters, and he read the shortest one aloud, the one in pencil on the back of a dispatch sheet from a terminal he had never identified. The words were plain. They were the words of someone who had considered what they needed to say and had found the simplest possible way to say it. And in the simplicity, there was a precision that more elaborate language would have dissolved. We are not asking for anything. We just want to know if the people at the top know we are down here. He set it on the table. He looked at a room with 110 people in it, and he said one sentence. They know now. The policy that came out of the board's final action on day 12 was 9 words long and has never been amended because the 9 words said everything the policy needed to say, and adding words to it would only have been a way of making it easier to not follow. Every visitor in the book is greeted by name. The book was relocated from the security desk in the lobby to the surface of the conference table in the 14th floor boardroom, open, where anyone who sat down at that table to conduct Bridgepoint's business had to make a physical choice to look at it or to look past it. Raymond Harris was offered a promotion. He asked for the time to think about it and used the time to come back with a counter. He wanted to keep his desk. He wanted the record, the full record, of everything he had documented to be understood as having been accurate and as having mattered. And he wanted a second officer assigned to the lobby for evening shifts, because there had been nights in 11 years when people had come into the lobby and had needed something, not necessarily from him specifically, but from a person. And there had been no one else there, and he had never been comfortable with that. And he had thought for a long time about whether to say so, and had decided today was the day. He got the desk. He got the record. He got the second officer. He was also assigned the task of walking every new hire at the Caldwell building through the visitor log on their first morning. And he did it the same way every time, the same sequence, the same unhurried pace. He opened the book to the Thursday in April. He pointed to the first line. He stepped back and let them read it themselves. Some of them took longer than others. The ones who took the longest were the ones he noted, privately, as the ones he thought might be worth watching. The wedding that had been scheduled for October did not happen. Neither party has made a public statement about who initiated the end of the engagement, and the question gets asked occasionally by people who follow the subsequent legal proceedings, and the answer is not technically in the public record. Technically, there is a sworn statement in a court file that makes the answer fairly accessible to anyone who reads with attention. Robert Williams sells industrial supply equipment in another state now, for a company with 11 employees and a regional client base and no industry association involvement. He has not spoken publicly about the events of the Thursday in April. He made one statement, through his attorney, early in the proceedings, and the statement characterized the day's events as a misunderstanding arising from a failure of scheduling communication, and the statement was accurate in the specific and limited way that statements are accurate when they have been designed to be accurate, and nothing more. Laura Clark handled the legal coordination with the efficiency Darnell had been relying on for 3 years, and she did not ask him once during the subsequent proceedings whether he was certain about any of the decisions he made, because in 3 years she had learned the answer to that question was always the same. He was certain. Whether certainty was the right posture was a question the proceedings would answer. She trusted the answer. Darnell Cooper drove back to Renner Yard that evening. He parked in the lot, and he sat in the truck for 4 minutes. The same 4 minutes he had sat in the visitor lot of the Caldwell building that morning. Before he went inside, the dock was quiet. The light over the loading bay was the particular color of late evening in April, the color that sits between gold and gray and belongs fully to neither. He went into the dispatch office and he sat at his desk and he looked at the window for a while. He did not bring the folding chair back that night. It arrived a week later, carried in the back of a truck by 2 men from the facilities crew who had been told where to put it and had asked no follow-up questions. It stood in the corner of the dispatch office with the bent front leg, giving it a barely perceptible list to the left. And it was there when people came to meet with him, and it was there when people left, and no one who worked for him asked about it more than twice, because twice was enough to understand that the question was going to be answered by the chair's presence, rather than by any words he chose to use about it. There is a practice, in certain industries, of placing objects in sight lines where they cannot be ignored, where the eye returns to them involuntarily during the routines of a workday. Pilots have their checklists. Surgeons have their counts. The objects are not decorations. They are not sentimental. They are the thing that keeps the critical knowledge from becoming the kind of knowledge that fades because it is never contradicted. The chair in the corner of the office at Renner Yard was that kind of object. It was the physical remainder of a question that had been asked and answered, and that needed to remain in the room where the decisions were made, so that the answer was never more than a glance away. Harold Reed's one sentence, delivered in a parking lot in January to a 16-year-old who would not fully understand it for another 10 years, had 2 halves. Darnell had lived the first half for 30 years. The second half he was still working out. He worked it out on the loading dock 2 mornings a year, in front of the people who moved freight for this company, and who deserved to hear it from the man who signed their checks, not as a policy statement, and not as a corporate value, and not as something that had been workshopped in a conference room, by people who had never stood on a loading dock in January, with their forearms going raw in the cold. You should not have to say your name to be treated like a person. But if you do, say it late, and say it for the people behind you who never got to say it at all. For 9 hours, one Thursday in April, 400 people went about their day in a building without knowing who was in the chair in the hallway outside the 14th floor boardroom. One of them crouched down, with knees that announced themselves, and asked the man's name. One of them kept a log that told the truth about everything it recorded. One of them, in a room without windows, held the weight of 2,300 people's Friday in a file she was not permitted to leave, and spent the day finding out what it costs to keep a promise when every channel available to you is closed. The rest went home. They ate dinner and watched television and went to bed and got up the next morning and drove back in. And on Friday, the deposits hit 2,300 accounts at 14 terminals across 4 states. And those 2,300 people bought groceries and paid bills and put gas in their vehicles, and none of them knew how close the Friday had come to being a different kind of day. None of them would know until the report became public. And when they read it, the detail that stayed with most of them, the detail that came up in the break rooms and on the docks and in the cab of the truck during the long hauls between terminals, was not the boardroom or the depositions or the settlement amounts or the policy change. It was the chair, the folding metal chair with the bent front leg, carried back from an alcove that smelled like floor cleaner, and placed with deliberate precision into the 4 small impressions in the carpet where a better chair had stood, placed there by a man who understood in his bones what his father had known about what it costs to hold your ground in a room that has decided you are nobody, and who had decided, before he arrived, that the cost was already paid. Who is sitting in your lobby right now? And does anyone there know what to call them?